On December 21, 1944, at 5:30 a.m., Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe found himself in the frigid basement command post of Bastogne, Belgium, observing German panzer tanks deploying for an attack that would decide the fate of his encircled troops over the next 2 days. As the leader of all Allied forces stationed there, McAuliffe oversaw units including the 1st Airborne Division, Combat Command B from the 10th Armored Division, various tank destroyer battalions and artillery battalions, and stragglers from other divisions. With around 18,000 men surrounded by 3 German divisions, McAuliffe, who was born in Washington, D.C., a West Point graduate finishing his studies in November 1918, assumed command due to the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, who was attending conferences in Washington. The Germans had completely encircled Bastogne that morning, cutting off all 7 highways leading into the town. McAuliffe's forces were outnumbered 5-1, lacking sufficient ammunition and winter clothing for most soldiers, with temperatures plummeting to -15 degrees Celsius. The nearest Allied reinforcements were located 60 kilometers away, battling through German lines to reach Bastogne. Opposing McAuliffe's troops were the 2nd Panzer Division, the 5th Panzer Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, all closing in on their objective. However, unbeknownst to the Germans, their strategy of encircling Bastogne rather than bypassing it was a critical tactical error. By concentrating their armored forces around Bastogne, they were setting themselves up for significant losses, equivalent to 5 divisions, and eliminating any chance of reaching their primary objectives. Over the next 8 days, events unfolded exactly as McAuliffe predicted. German armor suffered devastating casualties, and what appeared to be a catastrophic situation transformed into one of America's most decisive victories in World War II. The initial blow to American forces came on December 17 when the 10th Infantry Division collapsed under intense German pressure. As these reports reached McAuliffe, he was en route from France to assume command at Bastogne. A 6th Infantry Division was stationed on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge near the German border. Meanwhile, the Green Division, which had just arrived, was placed in the relatively quiet Ardennes sector to acclimate. At dawn on December 16, at 5:30 a.m., the Germans unleashed a devastating 90-minute artillery barrage from over 1,600 guns. This bombardment was followed by an assault involving tanks and infantry. Around 8,000 Americans surrendered in this operation, marking the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in Europe during World War II. McAuliffe had previously served with many of these officers at other stations and was well aware of their capabilities as soldiers. On December 17th, 8th Corps headquarters intercepted their last radio transmissions, desperate pleas for ammunition, air support, and any kind of assistance that were eventually replaced by static silence. Official reports later stated that the division had fought bravely under difficult conditions and delayed the German advance long enough to allow other units to prepare. While McAuliffe acknowledged some truth in these claims, he believed the primary issue was their unfavorable deployment and engagement in an unsuitable conflict. The American forces were spread thin along a defensive line and fell victim to the coordinated assaults by concentrated German armor. Another significant setback occurred on December 17 at Clairvaux, where the 28th Infantry Division defended against the 2nd Panzer Division's attack with its 16,000 soldiers and 2040 tanks. For 2 days, fierce street-to-street fighting ensued before the town fell to the Germans on December 18, opening up the road leading towards Bastogne. By December 19, from his vantage point at Camp Mormelon in France, McAuliffe had observed the destruction of 2 American divisions. It's crucial to avoid becoming stationary, as this exposes you to the risk of being overwhelmed by enemy forces. Being encircled often leads to destruction. This was well understood throughout the military ranks. Despite these warnings, on December 18 at 3:00 a.m., elements of the 1st Airborne Division began their journey northward from Camp Mormelon towards Bastogne. Mission was to defend the crossroads town regardless of the consequences. Additionally, most senior leaders were absent. Major General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington for staff meetings, while Brigadier General Gerald Higgins was in England. Consequently, Colonel Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander and a 46-year-old veteran with no infantry command experience at this level, took charge. Documents were being burned, trucks loaded with supplies were ready for departure, and artillery fire could be heard getting closer. According to Middleton, 3 or possibly 4 German divisions were converging on Bastogne from various directions. American units were scattered across the area, some destroyed, others retreating chaotically, while a few remained but were isolated and vulnerable. The road system was rapidly deteriorating, and within just one day, Bastogne could be entirely cut off. General Middleton had dispatched whatever troops he could muster to stall the advancing Germans. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, led by Colonel William Roberts, arrived a day earlier and was divided into 3 task forces. Major William Dubry's team de Zubry headed north to Nobel to impede the 2nd Panzer Division's advance. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry commanded Team Cherry towards Longueville to hinder the German panzer's progress. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara led Team O'Hara southeast to cover another potential approach route. Though these were modest units, each comprising around 400 soldiers and a handful of tanks along with tank destroyers, they represented Middleton's sole option for defense. The actions of these 10th Armored Division teams proved crucial in buying valuable time. In Novel on December 19th and 20th, Team de Zubry, bolstered by reinforcements from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, managed to fend off an entire division of the 2nd Panzer for a full 36 hours through fierce close-quarters tank battles amid foggy and snowy conditions. Although the Germans ultimately compelled the Americans to retreat, this delay cost the 2nd Panzer 2 days of progress and significant losses. By December 23rd, when Novel was finally overrun, the 101st Airborne had already fortified defensive positions around Bastogne. Team Cherry's efforts at Longueville were largely unsuccessful as they became surrounded and mostly destroyed, but still inflicted considerable damage on enemy vehicles and caused further delays. Meanwhile, Team O'Hara fought from December 19th to the 22nd in Wharton, employing a strategic fighting withdrawal that effectively hampered German advances. These small unit operations, characterized by valiant defensive stands despite being vastly outnumbered, provided the critical hours necessary for General McAuliffe to position the 101st Airborne Division. Middleton relied on these delaying actions to buy time for other forces to prepare an effective counterattack around Bastogne. It could be 3 days, it might stretch to a week, or even longer until they all succumbed. McAuliffe assured him they would Middleton sending Cauliffe fine sending, Tasses enning call 1 Brown, McCall 1 Brown browned, enning call 1 Brown browned, enning call 1 browned. 1942 enning call 1 drown, round 1942 enning call round, Mikel Wunder Julian Esau, Wunder 2 Osses Stew 27742 Raum, Wunder 2 Zen Incuses Bill, Wunder 2 7 First, Wunder 2 7 Process Arine des Armand Aun Vase. Any significant movement of mechanized forces required the use of Baston's roads. McAuliffe indicated the map and elaborated on what was about to unfold and how it would benefit the Americans. The Germans rely more heavily on these roads than we do. Their offensive strategy hinges on speed. They have approximately 4 days to reach the Meuse River before our reinforcements arrive. Covering 80 kilometers through difficult winter terrain in just 4 days is nearly impossible without utilizing the roads extensively. Their armored units cannot traverse the countryside effectively. All critical supply lines, fuel trucks, and ammunition vehicles for their spearhead divisions must pass through this road network. However, every supply convoy, each fuel tanker, and every ammunition truck destined for their spearhead divisions must travel through these roads. We are in a position to control them completely. When they encircle us, it is not merely a trap but an allocation of resources that could otherwise be used to push further west. Each tank deployed around our perimeter is one less heading towards the Meuse River. Each artillery battery they deploy against us is one less supporting their advance. Once these forces are committed, it becomes difficult for them to withdraw since we are causing disruptions behind their lines. Crucially, when they encircle us, they concentrate their troops around a fixed objective, our designated target. Their attacks will come from predictable directions and repeatedly target the same areas. We control the town, so we know exactly where they must approach from via the roads. This allows us to set up defensive positions, pre-plan our artillery support, and strategically place anti-tank weapons precisely where needed. When they launch their assault, they will face well-prepared defenses from predictable directions with extended supply lines vulnerable to harassment by our patrols. They must defend their flanks, rear, and supply routes. Meanwhile, once reinforcements break through, we will be perfectly positioned to cut off their supply lines permanently. What if the reinforcements fail to break through? What if the reinforcements fail to break through? McAuliffe responded, "Then we all perish, but the Germans won't reach Maastricht either because they would have squandered too much time and firepower trying to capture this town. In either scenario, their offensive will falter. The question is whether we survive long enough to witness it." The briefing concluded, and officers departed to position their units. While McAuliffe intellectually grasped the strategy, emotionally he still found it unsettling. Being surrounded seemed like a dire outcome, yet Middleton had made one irrefutable point in just 2 days. He witnessed the annihilation of 2 American divisions fighting against superior forces, spread thin across too many positions. They offered no resistance whatsoever. The 6th Division was overwhelmed due to their inability to focus their efforts at a single point. And a Bastogne to defend insignificant towns instead of defending one strategically important location with concentrated forces proved more effective than stretching them thin along an extensive front line. By noon on December 20th, the Germans had sealed off the area, cutting through all 7 main roads and completely encircling Bastogne. The defensive perimeter was irregular, adapting to both terrain features and village strongholds, extending roughly 26 kilometers, and manned by around 18,000 American troops. These included Colonel Roberts' hastily assembled group, known as Team Snafu, comprising soldiers from various units like the attached armor and tank destroyer elements, artillerymen, stragglers, and support personnel. The defensive strategy was successful because McAuliffe accurately anticipated the German tactics. The Germans would seek out weak points, exploit them by concentrating forces, and attempt to breach the center of Bastogne. However, the American defense did not aim to hold every inch of ground. Instead, it focused on absorbing enemy attacks, funneling them into kill zones where they could be destroyed with heavy artillery fire. Even when ground was temporarily lost, the overall defensive structure remained intact as long as continuous artillery support was maintained. Lieutenant Colonel Ewell's 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment defended the eastern perimeter from near Luzery along the railroad to Marvy, while Colonel Sink's forces held the sector northeast of the railroad up to Foy. Lieutenant Colonel Chapuy's 500th Regiment secured the northwestern sector between Four and Hemrel. Meanwhile, the 37th Glider Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Harper, stretched a thin line from the left flank of the 500 Tessent all the way to Marby in the south. In the center, 3 battalions of 55mm howitzers under Colonel Thomas Sherburne were strategically positioned and ready to fire in any direction. When infantry commanders requested support, the shells arrived within minutes, hitting their targets precisely. A mobile reserve consisting of approximately 40 tanks from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division was regrouped centrally after sustaining losses earlier in delaying enemy forces. Positioned to respond rapidly to any breakthroughs, these surviving armored units were prepared for immediate action. The first German probe occurred at 3:00 p.m. on December 20th, when a company from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division advanced northward along the road toward positions held by the 327th Glider Infantry. and fire with machine guns, rifles, and mortars. Within 8 minutes, the attack was broken, leaving 32 German bodies on the road. American casualties included 3 wounded soldiers, one of whom was seriously injured. From his command post, General McAuliffe monitored radio communications and began to understand what Major General Middleton had meant about the situation. The second assault commenced at 5:30 p.m., with 2 companies supported by tank cover. 6 Mark V Panzer tanks advanced toward the 5,000 Erst sector near Neff. However, they were halted after advancing to within 55 Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged them. Within 90 seconds, 3 German tanks were destroyed. The other forces withdrew and the infantry fell back. American losses included 5 wounded soldiers and 1 damaged Hellcat tank. German casualties amounted to around 80 fatalities and 3 destroyed tanks, effectively halting their offensive. Since no surviving troops were able to provide useful intelligence about American positions due to their retreat or demise, the Germans would probably attempt another assault on the same location with a similar approach, only to face prepared defenses once more. By December 21st, McAuliffe understood that defending Bastogne was not merely about maintaining control over territory, but rather about exhausting German forces more rapidly than they could replenish them. Each unsuccessful German attack resulted in significant losses of manpower and resources that the Germans couldn't sustain indefinitely. Meanwhile, every hour spent in futile assaults against Bastogne meant an hour wasted when their spearhead divisions could have been advancing further westward. The Germans were suffering heavy casualties without achieving any substantial objectives. The critical issue lay with supplies. Although Bastogne had originally served as a supply hub, most of its stockpiles had been relocated south before the German encirclement began. When the 101st arrived, they carried minimal ammunition and virtually no medical provisions, along with severely limited food supplies. By December 21st, ammunition was strictly rationed. Artillery units were permitted 10 rounds per gun each day, while automatic weapons usage was confined to brief bursts aimed at specific targets. Every bullet had to be used judiciously, because there weren't many more available. Food rations were even scarcer. The division had brought along roughly 2 days' worth of K rations. By December 22nd, these rations had been cut in half again to quarter rations. The temperature remained well below freezing throughout this period. Hunger, cold, and fatigue plagued the soldiers who lacked proper winter uniforms. They resorted to wearing any available clothing they could find from abandoned positions, fallen comrades, or local residents who had fled their homes. Medical supplies were practically depleted by then. On December 19th, when a German patrol overran the division's service area south of Bastogne, most medical personnel and equipment, including morphine, were captured. As a result, the remaining aid stations struggled to provide adequate care with whatever limited resources they had managed to carry from Camp Mormelon. Consequently, many wounded soldiers perished due to treatable injuries simply because there weren't sufficient supplies to address their needs effectively. On December 22nd at 11:00 a.m., 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag near the area held by the 327th Glider Infantry. The message demanded an unconditional surrender, stating that American forces were surrounded and outnumbered with no means to obtain supplies. It warned that capitulation was the only way to prevent complete destruction. 2 hours were given for a reply. The German message reached McAuliffe's command, with just one word: nuts my name. My answer is nuts. Tell them to take a hike, we're not giving in. When someone questioned his seriousness, McAuliffe replied unequivocally, absolutely true. The written response was sent back to the German officers and ultimately reached their commander. From the American leader, confused by this reply, the Germans asked what it meant. Colonel Harper, who escorted them, explained that it equated to telling them to go to hell. The Americans were firm in their refusal to surrender. This decision meant committing additional resources to the siege. As a result, von Leutwitz redirected the 2nd Panzer Division from its western advance and ordered it to join the assault on Bastogne, where Isesdases the Manser Lair to support the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in reinforcing their offensive capabilities. These forces, which should have been advancing towards other objectives, were now stationary outside Bastogne, preparing attacks that would ultimately prove unsuccessful. Dozens of these planes dropped a significant amount of aid across the defensive line. The supplies ranged from ammunition to medical kits, foodstuffs, and plasma. This large-scale resupply mission involved 241 Carry-7 aircraft that delivered around 44 tons of essential goods. Each bundle carried different items, marked accordingly: red crosses for medical packs, parachutes of various colors denoting specific contents such as ammunition cases or food containers. Not all the bundles landed within Bastogne's perimeter. Some drifted into German territory. In 2 Accident Astabat, the Germans watched helplessly as these supplies fell from the sky, understanding that each package extended the endurance of their American adversaries in Bastogne. Some German units attempted to shoot down the transport planes, but American fighter escorts intervened and drove them away. Thanks to this resupply effort, artillery batteries received enough ammunition to boost their daily allotment from 10 rounds per gun to 40. Infantry units were supplied with an estimated 50 rounds of rifle ammunition each, along with continuous belts for machine guns. Medical stations were supplied with plasma and morphine, along with surgical equipment and bandages. This resupply altered the tactical situation and boosted morale significantly. Soldiers who had been sparing ammunition now had enough to fight back effectively. Wounded soldiers who might have succumbed to shock due to a lack of medical supplies received plasma transfusions. The garrison transformed from being on the verge of collapse to becoming combat ready within just one afternoon. With P-47 Thunderbolts providing close air support against German positions along the perimeter. The panzers, which had been camouflaged for summer operations, stood out starkly against the snowy backdrop. The Thunderbolts made low-level runs in waves, deploying bombs and firing rockets and machine guns. From an observation post, McAuliffe witnessed 6 tanks being set ablaze within 20 minutes. As the Germans attempted to withdraw their armor through narrow forest roads, maneuvering became exceedingly difficult for them. More armored vehicles were destroyed, leaving burning wreckage behind. German infantry also fell victim to strafing runs. By late afternoon on December 23rd, German assaults had ceased, not out of surrender but because daylight operations under American air dominance posed severe risks. Nighttime attacks would be their only option since aircraft couldn't effectively engage in darkness. In the Kandai, however, nighttime offensives are more challenging and require superior coordination while offering less element of surprise to defenders anticipating an assault. The arrival of aerial support completely shifted the psychological landscape for McAuliffe's troops. They had endured 4 days surrounded by enemy forces, outnumbered, and questioning whether assistance would ever arrive. The sight of aircraft in the skies confirmed that help was indeed on its way, as did the airdrops indicating they hadn't been abandoned. The effectiveness of the fighter bombers demonstrated that the Germans no longer had control of the battlefield, while German morale plummeted. For 4 days they had been assaulting well-defended positions, suffering heavy casualties and equipment losses with no significant gains. Suddenly, daylight operations became impossible for them. On Christmas morning at 3:00 a.m., December 25th, the Germans initiated their main assault on the western perimeter. Reinforcements from Germany, including the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, spearheaded this attack. The assault emerged from the darkness, targeting the villages of Shams and Hemel in an attempt to breach Bastogne's center. The German infantry struck the 3007th Glider Infantry at 3:30 a.m., comprising roughly 2 regiments, or about 4,000 men with tank support. Despite achieving initial surprise and breaching American defenses, penetrating into Hemel's territory, General McAuliffe was awakened by gunfire and promptly rushed to his operations center to coordinate the defense. The American counterattack was methodical and precise. Once inside the perimeter, German tanks became vulnerable to fire from various directions. American tank destroyers stationed in depth engaged them from the flanks. Pre-registered artillery barrages were directed at their approach routes. Routes artillery dropped concentrated shells that disrupted following infantry waves. The German advance halted 600 meters within the perimeter due to the inability of tanks to proceed without infantry support, and infantry could not advance through the intense artillery fire. At 8:00 a.m., McAuliffe instructed neighboring units to launch counterattacks. Intense room-to-room battles erupted in Hemmerow, with grenades thrown through windows and fierce close-quarters engagements occurring on the streets. By noon, the Germans began retreating. All of their infiltrating tanks were either destroyed or left behind. Infantry forces withdrew to their initial positions. American losses amounted to roughly 300 soldiers, while German casualties were estimated at around 500 troops and 18 damaged tanks. The Christmas offensive represented the Germans' best opportunity to capture Bastogne. Despite achieving surprise and breaching the defenses, their efforts ultimately failed. McAuliffe's strategic planning, concentrated defense, well-coordinated artillery fire, layered defenses, proved effective, turning the German advance into a decisive kill zone where they suffered heavy losses. On December 26 at 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding a platoon of tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion within the 4th Armored Division, broke through the German lines south of Bastogne, near Ardennes, and connected with American engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Upon being informed by radio, McAuliffe rushed to greet the relief column. With this breakthrough, the siege was officially over. Supplies now flowed into Bastogne, wounded soldiers were evacuated, and medical care became more readily available. Although the Germans did not fully withdraw from the region, they ceased their direct assault on Bastogne's perimeter, maintaining control only of certain surrounding areas. The encirclement had been breached, yet the fighting persisted for another 3 weeks. Unbeknownst to the Germans, they had already lost not just the Battle of Bastogne, but also their entire offensive effort. By focusing on Bastogne for 8 days, they disrupted their own schedule. The spearhead divisions never made it to the Meuse River. They ran out of fuel and time, losing all momentum in the process. This German perspective illustrates how decisively the Battle of Bastogne shattered their offensive strategy. Lieutenant General Heinrich von Leutwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps, which was tasked with capturing Bastogne. As a seasoned veteran at 59 years old, he had extensive experience with armored operations across multiple fronts over 4 years of war. His forces comprised 3 divisions: the 2nd Panzer Division under Colonel Minrad von Lau, the 5th Panzer Division led by General Lieutenant Fritz Bohlin, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, commanded by General Major Heinz Kakott. The American 8th Corps was disintegrated, and the 16th Infantry Division had surrendered. Meanwhile, the 28th Infantry Division was dispersed. American forces were retreating in a state of disorder, with roads leading west appearing open. Intelligence suggested that American reserves were scattered and would take several days to regroup. The path to the Meuse seemed clear at this point. Von Leutwitz's initial directives for Bastogne were straightforward: capture it by surprise. If feasible, attack; otherwise, bypass and avoid becoming entangled in unnecessary engagements. The primary goal was to reach the Meuse River near Dong, located 80 kilometers west of Bastogne. Speed was crucial since the success of the operation hinged on German armored units arriving at the river before American reinforcements could arrive. The 2nd Panzer Division had penetrated north of Bastogne and breached American defenses in Noville. Meanwhile, Panzer Lehr was moving eastward, clearing villages along the southern route. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division followed up by securing the roads, all according to schedule. It appeared that Bastogne was defenseless, guarded only by isolated American units. Von Leutwitz contemplated sending a single regiment to capture Bastogne while his main forces proceeded westward. However, on December 19th, German intelligence detected American airborne troops in the town. Various sources, radio intercepts, captured prisoners, and reconnaissance reports verified that the elite 111st Airborne Division had been deployed overnight to establish defensive positions. This revelation drastically altered the situation. Airborne divisions were not random rear area units but highly trained, experienced infantry equipped with formidable firepower. Seizing Bastogne would no longer be a simple task, it promised to be a fierce battle. Von Leutwitz's decision at that moment would prove pivotal and potentially fatal for his offensive. He opted to encircle Bastogne and confine the American troops while his main units advanced westward. He planned to address the town later, but bypassing it entirely would leave a significant American contingent behind his lines, posing a threat to his supply routes. Consequently, he allocated forces for the siege. The Americans in Bastogne were conducting patrols, ambushing supply convoys, and calling down artillery fire on German positions. They were neither contained nor passive, they posed a serious threat, and higher command was pressing for tangible progress. The offensive was lagging behind schedule, and fuel supplies for his advanced divisions were dwindling because supply trucks could not penetrate the area. Von Leutwitz knew he had to capture Bastogne to safeguard his supply lines. On December 22nd, von Leutwitz issued a surrender demand, believing that the Americans would recognize their precarious situation and agree to honorable terms. However, their response was bewildering and infuriating, forcing him to commit substantial forces for an assault on Bastogne, resources he desperately needed elsewhere. By December 23rd, the weather had cleared, allowing American aircraft to drop supplies to Bastogne, while fighter bombers targeted his positions. His tanks, camouflaged for summer conditions, stood out against the snow, making them visible from above, and assembly areas were exposed to aerial reconnaissance. Its supply routes were under attack, and there was nothing he could do about it since Germany's air force had been virtually wiped out. It lacked the capability to challenge American air supremacy. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division bled dry while confronting American defenses. By December 26th, when General George Patton's Third Army breached from the south, von Leutwitz realized Bastogne was lost. But more critically, he understood that the entire offensive had failed. His forces had spent 9 days fighting for a single town instead of advancing westward. The timeline was shattered. The Meuse was out of reach. Moreover, the Americans now controlled Bastogne, positioning themselves in his rear and cutting off his supply lines, threatening everything behind him. General Hasso von Manteuffel led the 5th Panzer Army, which served as the main striking force for the offensive. His plan demanded reaching the Meuse by December 19th. However, by December 21st, his spearhead divisions were still 40 kilometers short of their goal and were bogged down around Bastogne. His supply lines were entirely disrupted because Bastogne controlled the road network. Von Manteuffel attempted to bypass Bastogne by sending the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr divisions westward around the town. The 2nd Panzer Division, commanded by Colonel Minrad von Lohr, was supposed to be the spearhead division that would reach the Meuse first and secure bridgeheads for follow-on forces. Von Lohr was an experienced commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, confident in his unit's capabilities. On December 19th, his division broke through American positions north of Bastogne and raced westward with over 100 operational tanks. For 3 days, the 2nd Otto Panzer Division made impressive progress, bypassing American strongpoints and avoiding major engagements while focusing on speed. By December 22nd, they had advanced approximately 60 kilometers and were nearing the town of Dino along the Meuse River. Von Lauo could observe the river valley from his command vehicle and was just 5 kilometers away from reaching the operational objective set by Hitler. However, their progress abruptly halted when the division's fuel trucks, which were expected to arrive via Bastogne, failed to materialize. American forces stationed in Bastogne had effectively blocked supply routes, ambushing convoys and calling in artillery strikes on key road junctions. The fuel intended for sustaining 2nd Panzer's momentum was instead consumed by burning wrecked vehicles 50 kilometers behind the front lines. On December 23rd, von Lau's tanks and support vehicles began running low on fuel. They were immobilized west of Bastogne and became easy targets for American reconnaissance aircraft and fighter bombers once the weather improved. On December 24th, von Lau received intelligence indicating that American armored forces, including the 2nd Armored Division and elements of the 84th Infantry Division, were advancing to encircle his position. Were advancing to withdraw but was denied by higher command, which instructed him to hold the current position, wait for supplies, and prepare to resume the attack. Unfortunately, supplies never arrived due to American control over the roads leading into Bastogne. On December 26th, the advance unit of the 2nd Panzer Division found itself trapped near Celles due to a lack of fuel and was subsequently overwhelmed and eliminated by American forces. Major Ernst von Kochenhausen oversaw the operations of the 2nd Panzer Battle Group in Celles. Despite his efforts to break out from the encirclement, he failed and instead opted to wait for reinforcements that never arrived. On December 20th, Major Kochenhausen led around 600 men on foot through American lines after abandoning their tanks. They left behind almost all of the division's remaining armored vehicles, including over 100 tanks, assault guns, and half-tracks, which were captured by the Americans. Attempts to rescue the 2nd Panzer Division included 2 attacks launched towards Celles by a relief force, but both were thwarted by American fighter bombers and ground troops. Following these failed attempts, the Panzer leadership decided to withdraw. The division had begun its offensive with more than 15,000 men and approximately 90 tanks. By December 28th, it was reduced to fewer than 8,000 soldiers and less than 20 operational tanks, rendering it ineffective as a combat unit. Meanwhile, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which had been engaged in attacking Bastogne for 9 days, was severely depleted. Starting with an initial strength of about 17,000 men, by December 28th, effective manpower had dwindled to perhaps 7,000 due to casualties from ground assaults, airstrikes, and artillery bombardment. The division's ability to conduct offensive operations was severely compromised, leaving it barely capable of defending its positions. For German commanders, the events at Bastogne were a stark failure in operational planning. They had anticipated that American forces would scatter upon encountering a surprise offensive, but instead found themselves facing concentrated American defenses around Bastogne. Additionally, the Germans believed they could bypass key strongholds and deal with them later, an assumption that proved erroneous. Bastogne held the key terrain features, road networks, and could not be circumvented. However, on December 23rd, the skies cleared, allowing American air supremacy to dismantle German mobility. Most importantly, it was only later that German commanders understood they had fallen into a strategic trap by encircling Bastogne. They mistakenly thought they were besieging an isolated American force, but in reality, their mobile divisions had been drawn towards a stationary objective, where the Americans could systematically destroy them with well-prepared defenses and air support. Each day spent at Bastogne caused further delays to the offensive schedule. Once the siege was lifted on December 26th, Bastogne became a strategic threat pointing directly at German rear areas. By January 1, 1945, the Battle of Bastogne was essentially concluded. Although sporadic fighting continued for several weeks, the Germans withdrew and set up distant defensive positions to retain what little they had gained. They lost their ability to maneuver strategically. Their panzer divisions were severely depleted. One division entered the battle with 100 tanks and 16,000 men, but by January 5th, reported only 28 operational tanks and fewer than 8,000 effective troops, having suffered 92 tank losses and 8,000 casualties. Another division that began with 57 tanks and 15,000 men had dwindled to just 15,000 tanks and 7,000 effectives by the same date, enduring 40 tank losses and another 8,000 casualties. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division suffered a staggering loss of 7,000 men out of its initial strength of Nissenmen out of its initial strength of Monzenalet around Bastogne. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, which was committed on December 25th, saw a reduction in numbers by 60% within just 1 week. Units that were rotated through the fighting area also experienced comparable casualty rates. According to the German Army Group B's after-action report, total German casualties near Bastogne amounted to more than 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing, along with over 2,000 tanks and assault guns either destroyed or abandoned. Ardennes basted its reserves for the Ardennes Est because Germany had already exhausted its reserves for the Ardennes offensive. Once these troops were eliminated during battles around Bastogne and elsewhere, there was no backup available. The panzer divisions that fell at Bastogne could have been deployed to defend the Rhine River or hinder the Allied advance into Germany. Instead, they were obliterated in a futile assault against American defenses. The defenders of Bastogne also sustained significant casualties. However, their losses were manageable compared to those of the Germans, and their victory had strategic importance. Between December 19, 1944 and January 6, 1945, the 1st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 5,116 missing. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division incurred approximately 500 casualties. The total American casualty figure at Bastogne was around 2,500 DV. Unlike the Germans, American losses could be replenished with available reinforcements and replacements from their robust logistics system. Moreover, they had secured a critical victory by holding Bastogne, crippling German divisions in the process, and effectively ending Germany's final offensive in the West. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gained widespread recognition for his succinct reply to a surrender demand. For his exploits during the Battle of Bastogne, he received the Distinguished Service Cross from General Patton on December 30, 1944. The citation highlighted his exceptional bravery, inspiring leadership, and unwavering presence under enemy fire while directing his troops. Who was promoted to Major General on January 3, 1945, and took command of the 100 Infantry Division, marking his first division-level infantry command. Under his guidance, the 100 participated in the concluding months of World War I in Europe, crossing the Rhine River, advancing through southern Germany and Austria. His division captured Innsbruck, Austria, and advanced to the Brenner Pass, connecting Italy and Austria. Post-war, he remained active within the military, occupying several significant roles. He served as the Chief of the Chemical Corps and head of Army personnel. In 1953, he was appointed commander of the 7th Army in Europe. 2 years later, he assumed command of United States Army Europe, one of the most crucial commands during the Cold War era. He attained the rank of 4-star general in 1955. After 38 years of service, he retired from the Army in 1956. Following his military career, he worked as an executive at American Cyanamid Corporation until 1963 and served as chairman of the New York State Civil Defense Commission from 1960 to 1963, applying his extensive military background to civilian emergency preparedness planning. Reflecting on Bastogne in later years, he maintained that the 1st Airborne Division did not require relief. They had placed the Germans precisely where they intended. He recognized that encircling Bastogne was a strategic triumph rather than an American misstep. McAuliffe passed away on August 10, 1975, at age 77 due to leukemia. He was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors alongside his wife, son, and daughter. Lieutenant General George Patton, who had broken through to relieve Bastogne, deemed it one of the finest operations of his career. The reason for this assessment wasn't just that Third Army had rescued trapped forces, rather, it was because the 1st Airborne Division at Bastogne had immobilized several German divisions in place, allowing Third Army to attack from an unexpected direction. The relief of Bastogne wasn't a simple rescue mission, but the second phase of a meticulously planned operation aimed at crippling German offensive capabilities in the West. German General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during this period, was captured and extensively interviewed about the Ardennes offensive in 1945. He identified Bastogne as the turning point where the offensive faltered. The delay caused by American resistance at Bastogne disrupted the timetable, and the concentration of German forces around Bastogne created an ideal target for American artillery and air power. Consequently, the loss of panzer divisions at Bastogne undermined the mobility necessary for the offensive's success. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Euler, who commanded the 51st Parachute Infantry Regiment during the Battle of Bastogne, survived and went on to have a distinguished career, eventually reaching lieutenant general status. He served in Korea in 1973. When reflecting on Bastogne, he stressed the significance of junior leaders and individual soldiers who held their positions under extreme conditions. The lessons learned from Bastogne profoundly influenced American military doctrine for decades. The notion that defensive positions on critical terrain can immobilize enemy forces and create opportunities for counterattacks became a cornerstone of Cold War defensive planning. Furthermore, the coordination between artillery, air power, infantry, and defensive operations at Bastogne set a standard studied in military schools worldwide. In 1948, the Belgian government bestowed the Croix d'Or on the town of Bastogne for its defense. Meanwhile, the American 1/1 Airborne Division was honored with the Presidential Unit Citation, which is the highest unit award in the U.S. military. To honor their American allies, several streets within Bastogne were renamed after these units. But the town erected monuments to commemorate the battle's events, and every December, Bastogne hosts ceremonies to remember the conflict. Military historians have estimated that 5 German divisions were rendered ineffective or destroyed as a result of the defense at Bastogne. These divisions included the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and elements of the 9th Panzer Division, and elements of the 9th Panzer Division. While not all were completely annihilated, each suffered significant losses that rendered them incapable of offensive operations for the rest of the war. At the beginning of the offensive, these divisions collectively comprised about 50,000 men and 350 tanks. By mid-January 1945, their effective strength had dwindled to around 20,000 soldiers with fewer than 100 operational tanks. This strategic loss in German armored reserves significantly impacted the defense of Germany against Allied advances later in the year. In March 1945, when the Allies crossed the Rhine River, they encountered less resistance due to the decimation of panzer divisions during the Battle of Bastogne and other engagements throughout the Ardennes offensive. This allowed the final Allied push towards the Elbe River and their link-up with Soviet forces to progress more swiftly. General McAuliffe's decision to hold Bastogne and his recognition that being encircled could be tactically advantageous rather than catastrophic exemplifies a crucial military principle: controlling key terrain and forcing the enemy to attack prepared defenses grants an immense strategic advantage. Regardless of German mobility, armor, or tactical prowess, they were unable to overcome the well-prepared American defenses at Bastogne. That's the true lesson learned in Bastogne. American troops didn't fall into the Germans' trap. Instead, they lured German forces to triation. One sayings hadik axbacks on nen and nem main, one sayings on nem main, and facts in zon bays in zon axbacks property, in zon sayings on bays on, one sayings on mains on days on, one son, you will be on